My place card at my wife's annual corporate retreat read, "Worthless loser." She saw it. Her boss saw it, and the two of them laughed so hard they nearly knocked over their champagne flutes. I didn't say a word. I stood up, straightened my tie, found the CEO across the ballroom, and whispered exactly 3 sentences in his ear. Then I walked out into the cold Chicago night, got into my car, and drove home alone. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., an all-hands email went out to 1,400 employees. Subject line: Leadership and Structural Realignment effective immediately. By noon, the entire marketing division, including my wife and her boss, was terminated. My name is Nathaniel Whitaker. Most people call me Nate. I'm 46 years old. Up until that Saturday evening in November, my wife believed I was a mild-mannered financial advisor who worked from home and preferred staying out of the spotlight. She had no idea I owned 58% of the company she worked for. She had no idea, because I made absolutely sure she never would. Let me back up, because the place card wasn't the beginning of this story. It was only the moment the whole rotten structure finally cracked open. I live in a quiet, tree-lined suburb about 30 minutes outside Chicago, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always trimmed and the neighbors wave from their driveways but never ask too many questions. I drive a silver Toyota Camry that's a few years old, nothing flashy, nothing that turns heads in a parking lot. I wear the same rotation of button-down shirts, blue, gray, the occasional white one for special occasions. I've ordered the same coffee from the same corner cafe for 8 straight years. The barista, a college kid named Ellie, knows my order before I even step up to the counter. Black coffee, no sugar, no room for cream. Nobody who saw me picking up that coffee, or mowing my own lawn on a Saturday morning, or standing quietly at the back of a school fundraiser, would ever guess that 15 years ago I built and sold a cybersecurity firm for more than $280 million. I was 31 when the deal closed. I remember sitting in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Chicago, signing page after page while lawyers in sharp suits nodded and shook my hand. I remember walking out of that building afterward and just standing on the sidewalk for a few minutes, letting the wind hit my face, trying to understand what had just happened to my life. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't buy a mansion on the lake. I bought a modest 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, the same one I still live in today, and I quietly funneled almost all of that money into a private equity vehicle I built from scratch. Over the next decade, that vehicle acquired controlling stakes in a handful of mid-sized companies, a regional logistics firm, a specialty manufacturing outfit downstate, and eventually, about 6 years ago, a growing digital marketing and events agency headquartered in downtown Chicago called Summit Edge Group. I never put my name on the door of any of these companies. I structured every acquisition through holding entities with names so bland and forgettable that even the people who worked there day in and day out never thought twice about who was actually cutting the checks. Halbrook Meridian Partners, Ashford Klein Capital, names engineered to disappear the moment you read them, filed away in footnotes on quarterly reports nobody below the C-suite ever bothered to read closely. I liked it that way. I've always believed that money talks loudest when it doesn't talk at all. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from being underestimated. When people don't know what you're capable of, they show you exactly who they are, unfiltered, because they've already decided you're not worth performing for. I learned more about human nature standing quietly at the back of boardrooms and holiday parties, watching people posture and jockey for position, than I ever could have learned with my name stitched across a building lobby. My accountant, a careful, gray-haired man named Walter who has handled my finances since before the cybersecurity sale even closed, is one of maybe 4 people on earth who understand the full shape of what I own. My lawyer is another. Neither of them talks about it, and neither did I, not even to Victoria. Especially not to Victoria, as it turned out, though I didn't see the especially part clearly until much later. I met Victoria 9 years ago at a lakeside cabin party in Wisconsin that a mutual friend from college had thrown over Labor Day weekend. She was 32 then, sharp-eyed, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of strangers and somehow make it feel like the room had been waiting for her. She worked in brand strategy at a mid-sized agency at the time, and she talked about her campaigns the way other people talk about their kids, with pride, with detail, with an intensity that I found genuinely attractive. I remember standing near the fire pit that night, half listening to someone else's story about a fishing trip, while my eyes kept drifting over to where Victoria was holding court with 3 or 4 people, laughing, gesturing, completely in her element. I liked her confidence. I liked that she never apologized for wanting more out of life. I told her that night, half joking, that she should run for office someday. She laughed and said she'd settle for a corner office first. We started dating a few weeks later. She'd text me pictures of campaign mock-ups late at night, asking what I thought, and I'd give her honest feedback that had nothing to do with finance and everything to do with paying attention. I think that's part of what she liked about me early on. I actually listened. I didn't try to compete with her energy. I just gave her room to fill it. 2 years after that first party, we married in a small, intimate ceremony by the same lake where we'd met. It was late September, the kind of golden, unhurried afternoon the Midwest only gives you a handful of times a year. String lights wound through the trees along the shoreline. Her sister gave a toast that made everyone cry, including me. My father, still alive back then, danced badly and unapologetically to a song none of us recognized, spinning Victoria's aunt around the dance floor while everyone laughed and clapped along. Victoria wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and cried twice during the vows, and I remember thinking, standing there under those string lights, that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. We settled into the suburban home I already owned, the one I'd bought years before I met her, paid off in full, no mortgage, no strings. She joked in those early years that she'd married a man who somehow owned his house outright at 30-something without ever explaining how. I told her I'd been careful with money. That much, at least, was true. From the outside, we looked like the picture of a modern, comfortable marriage. From the inside, something had already begun to shift, slowly enough that neither of us named it for years. I want to be honest here, because this isn't a story about a perfect marriage torn apart by a stranger. It's a story about resentment that built up gradually, the way rust creeps along the underside of a car you never bother to look at until the whole thing gives out. Victoria wanted status. She wanted the corner office, the title, the recognition. And to her credit, she worked incredibly hard for it. She left the smaller agency 2 years into our marriage and joined Summit Edge Group as a brand strategist. Within 18 months, she'd been promoted to senior manager. She came home some nights glowing with pride, telling me about a campaign she'd pitched, a client she'd won over, a budget she'd fought for and gotten. I listened to all of it. I nodded in the right places. I asked questions like any supportive husband would. What I never told her was that I already knew about most of these campaigns before she mentioned them at dinner, because I sat on quarterly reports that crossed my desk through the holding company. I knew her name from performance reviews long before she ever thought to introduce me to anyone from her office. I kept the wall between Nate the husband and Nate the owner completely impenetrable. It wasn't dishonesty, I told myself. It was privacy. It was keeping my business life separate from my home life, the way plenty of people do. But somewhere along the way, that wall stopped protecting our marriage and started hiding it from itself. Because as Victoria climbed, something in her began to change. The gratitude I used to hear in her voice when she talked about her job slowly curdled into something closer to entitlement. She started making comments about my career, my quiet, unremarkable career as a financial advisor, that had an edge to them I hadn't noticed creeping in. "I don't know how you do the same thing every single day," she said once, only half joking, while getting ready for a work dinner I wasn't invited to. Doesn't it get boring just moving numbers around for other people? I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. About 3 years ago, Summit Edge Group brought in a new executive vice president of client strategy, a man named Damien Caldwell. Damien was 43, always tanned in that way that suggested a standing weekly appointment somewhere, and he drove a Porsche that he mentioned in almost every conversation, whether it was relevant or not. He had a gift, and I mean this in the most clinical, professional sense, for making people feel like they were one clever comment away from being welcomed into his inner circle, right up until the moment they stopped being useful to him, at which point he dropped them without a flicker of guilt. Victoria fell under his spell almost immediately, not romantically, but professionally, the way an ambitious person falls under the spell of someone who seems to hold the keys to the next level. Damien became her direct boss within the year, and from that point forward, dinner conversations at our house were dominated by Damien this, Damien that. Damien's vision for the client portfolio, Damien's plans for restructuring the account teams, Damien's opinion on everything from creative direction to office seating charts. I met Damien twice before that November night at the retreat. Both times at low-key company events Victoria had begged me to attend, insisting it would be good for her to have Nate there, to show I have a life outside the office. Both times, Damien shook my hand with a firm, practiced grip, called me pal, asked what I did, nodded absently at my vague answer about financial consulting, and forgot I existed the moment somebody more interesting walked past. Damien didn't know who approved his department's budget. Damien didn't know whose signature was on the majority ownership documents filed with the state. All Damien knew was that I was Victoria's quiet, forgettable husband, the boring guy who did something with spreadsheets and was beneath his notice. That should have been my warning sign, watching a man dismiss me so completely without a second thought. But if I'm honest, some part of me almost enjoyed being underestimated. It meant I could watch, unfiltered, exactly how people behaved when they thought no one who mattered was paying attention. The real fracture in my patience came about 8 months before the retreat. I'd approved a routine restructuring across 2 of Summit Edge Group's regional offices, the kind of unglamorous, necessary decision that happens in growing companies, consolidating overlapping account teams, reallocating budget toward the divisions actually generating revenue. It was standard. It affected maybe 30 positions company-wide, most of them through attrition and reassignment rather than layoffs. It also happened to ripple down into Victoria's team, tightening her budget for a campaign she'd been excited about. She came home that night furious. She threw her bag down on the kitchen counter hard enough that her keys skidded across the granite and onto the floor. She ranted for almost 20 minutes about out-of-touch investors, who had no idea what it actually took to run a creative department, and didn't understand the first thing about the business, and were just squeezing every department for numbers on a spreadsheet without caring who it hurt. I sat at the kitchen table, listening, nodding sympathetically, saying things like that sounds incredibly frustrating and I'm sorry you're dealing with that. Inside, I felt something settle into place, cold and clear. She was talking about me. She just didn't know it. I never let on. Not that night and not in the months that followed, even as similar comments kept surfacing. The board doesn't care about culture. Whoever's really pulling the strings around here has never had to sit through one client meeting in their life. Each time, I absorbed it quietly, filed it away, and kept moving. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't looking for an excuse to blow up my marriage. I loved Victoria, or at least I loved the version of her I'd married by that lake in Wisconsin. Part of me kept waiting for her to come back to herself, to remember the person who used to thank me for believing in her before she'd even landed her first big client. But the retreat gave me my answer. Summit Edge Group's annual corporate retreat was held that year at a hotel ballroom downtown, a black tie affair meant to celebrate another strong fiscal year, reward top performers, and as the invitation put it, recognize the people who make our success possible. Spouses and partners were invited for the evening portion, a formal dinner following an afternoon of team-building sessions I was thankfully spared. I almost didn't go. I'd skipped the last 2 years, citing work conflicts that weren't entirely fabricated, but Victoria had asked in a rare soft moment if I would come this time. "It would mean a lot to me," she'd said. "I want people to meet you." I said yes before I could think better of it. I wore my one good tuxedo. I drove us downtown myself so she could have a glass of wine without worrying about the ride home. In the car, she seemed nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her in years, checking her makeup in the visor mirror, asking twice if her dress looked all right. For a moment, driving down Lake Shore Drive with the skyline lit up gold against the November dark, I let myself believe the evening might actually go well. The ballroom was exactly what you'd expect. Crystal chandeliers throwing soft light across the room, round tables draped in white linen, a string quartet playing quietly near the bar as 300 employees and their partners mingled with drinks in hand. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and passed appetizers, and somewhere near the stage, a slideshow looped through photos from the past year, team outings, client wins, smiling faces I half recognized from Victoria's stories over the years. Place cards marked every seat at the reserved tables near the front, elegant calligraphy on ivory cardstock, the kind of detail an events company like Summit Edge Group would take particular pride in getting right. It struck me, walking past table after table of perfectly lettered names, just how much craftsmanship went into every detail of that night, which made what waited for me at our table even harder to write off as some kind of innocent accident. Victoria led me toward our table, practically glowing, introducing me to a few colleagues along the way. Then we reached our seats. My place card read, "Worthless loser." I stood there for a moment, staring at the two words written in the same elegant calligraphy as every other card on the table, clearly not a printing error, clearly not a mistake, but a deliberate custom addition. I looked up. Victoria had already seen it. Her hand was over her mouth, but not in horror. In laughter. Genuine, can't-help-it laughter, the kind that comes out before you can stop it. And standing just behind her, Damien Caldwell was laughing even harder, one hand braced on the back of a chair, his champagne glass tilting dangerously in the other. "Oh my God," he wheezed, wiping at the corner of his eye. "Victoria, I told you it would land." I understood immediately. This hadn't been some random prankster at the printing company. This had been planned. An inside joke, crafted deliberately between my wife and her boss, at my expense, in a room full of 300 people who worked for a company I owned the majority of. A few people at nearby tables noticed and let out awkward, uncertain laughs, unsure whether this was some kind of cute inside joke between a couple or something else entirely. One woman I didn't recognize glanced at the card, then at me, then quickly looked away, her smile faltering into something closer to second-hand embarrassment. Victoria was still laughing, not looking at me, not checking to see how I'd taken it. Damien clinked his glass against hers. "To honesty in labeling," he said, and they both dissolved into another fit of laughter, loud enough that a passing server slowed his step for a half-second before continuing on. I felt something in my chest go very still and very quiet. Not rage, not exactly. Something colder than that. Something final. It wasn't the two words on the card that did it, not really. It was the sound of her laugh, a laugh I recognized. The same one from our wedding. The same one I used to fall asleep to on quiet Sunday mornings, now aimed at me instead of shared with me. 9 years of marriage compressed into one unmistakable sound, and in that sound I finally heard, without any ambiguity left to hide behind, exactly where I stood in her eyes. I didn't say a word to either of them. I pulled out my chair, set my jacket over the back of it, and sat down as if nothing at all had happened. Victoria glanced at me once, still smiling, maybe checking whether I was a good sport about it. I smiled back, small and even. "Cute," I said, and reached for my water glass. I let the dinner proceed. I made polite conversation with the couple across from us, a soft-spoken account manager and her husband, who both seemed faintly uncomfortable by what they'd witnessed but said nothing. I ate my meal. I clapped along with everyone else when the CEO, a decent, overworked man named Richard Sorensen, who had no idea what percentage of his own company I controlled, took the stage to give his annual remarks about the year's growth and the team's hard work. When dinner wrapped and people began drifting toward the bar and the dance floor, I excused myself from the table, telling Victoria I needed some air. She waved me off, already deep in conversation with two other women from her department, one of whom I noticed glancing at my empty seat with something like pity. I found Richard near the edge of the room, checking his phone, looking like a man ready to go home. I introduced myself properly for the first time in 3 years of quiet ownership. "Richard, I'm Nate Whitaker. I control the Halbrook Meridian holding entity." I watched the recognition land in his eyes. He knew that name from every quarterly filing he'd ever signed off on, even if he'd never connected it to Victoria's husband standing 3 feet away from him at a company party. I said 3 sentences to him. I told him what I'd witnessed. I told him it reflected a pattern of behavior in that department that I'd been quietly monitoring for some time. And I told him that, as majority owner, I expected a full review of the marketing division's leadership by end of business the next day. Richard's face went pale, then very serious, very fast. "Understood, Mr. Whitaker," he said. "I'll have HR and legal on this first thing tomorrow." I nodded once, thanked him for his time, and walked out of that ballroom into the cold Chicago night without saying goodbye to Victoria. I drove myself home. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. I made a cup of tea, sat in my study, and waited. I want to be clear about something, because this matters. What happened next wasn't an act of petty personal revenge dressed up as a business decision. It was the business decision I should have made months earlier, the moment restructuring conversations first exposed how casually that department had come to treat the people whose money kept their division funded. The retreat simply removed the last reason I had for delaying it. I spent that Saturday night compiling the notes I'd need. I wasn't inventing a case. The material had been sitting in front of me for months. Budget overruns Damien had quietly buried in reporting. 2 formal complaints from junior staff about his management style that had been softened into vague coaching conversations instead of real action. A pattern, now confirmed in person, of a leadership culture that mocked the very ownership structure funding their paychecks, apparently for sport. By Sunday morning, I'd had a call with Richard and with our outside counsel. By Sunday evening, the paperwork for a leadership restructuring across the marketing and client strategy divisions was finalized, effective immediately, framed, accurately, as a long-overdue realignment following a pattern of performance and conduct issues at the senior level. Monday morning at 8:30 a.m., the email went out to all 1,400 employees of Summit Edge Group. Leadership and structural realignment, effective immediately. It was carefully worded, professional, free of any personal detail, citing a comprehensive review of departmental performance and leadership alignment with company values. By noon, Damien Caldwell had been let go, along with 2 other senior managers in his direct chain who'd enabled or ignored the toxic culture under his leadership. Victoria's position, restructured out of existence as part of the broader realignment, was eliminated as well. Generous severance packages went out to everyone affected, more generous than legally required, because I've never believed cruelty needed to be part of doing the right thing. But the doors closed, firmly and completely, that same afternoon. Victoria called me 4 times before noon. I didn't answer. I wanted her to come home and hear this from me directly, not filtered through panic and speculation in a parking garage. She arrived home around 2 in the afternoon, still in the blazer she'd worn to what she thought was a normal Monday, her face pale, her hands visibly shaking as she set her bag down on the same kitchen counter where she'd once thrown her keys in anger 8 months earlier. "Nate," she said, her voice tight, "my entire department got wiped out today. Damien's gone. I'm gone. Some kind of restructuring came out of nowhere and nobody has any answers, and I need you to I need to sit down for a second." I poured 2 glasses of wine, set one in front of her at the kitchen table, and sat down across from her the way I had 8 months before, when she'd ranted about out-of-touch investors without knowing one was sitting 3 feet away. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to just listen until I'm finished." I told her everything: the cybersecurity firm I'd built and sold before we met, the $280 million, the private equity vehicle, the controlling stake in Summit Edge Group, acquired years before she'd ever accepted her first offer letter there. I told her I'd known about her promotions before she came home to tell me about them. I told her I'd sat quietly through months of her venting about out-of-touch investors, knowing full well she was talking about me. And then I told her about the place card, about her laughter, about Damien's laughter, about the 3 sentences I'd said to Richard Sorensen before walking out of that ballroom alone. Victoria stared at me for a long time. I watched something behind her eyes recalibrate everything she thought she'd understood about the last 9 years of her life. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you own the company, that you've owned it this whole time, and you let me think." "I let you have your own career," I said. "I never once interfered in a promotion, a project, a client win. Everything you built at that company you built yourself. I made sure of that. But I also watched what that company, and that job, and that man, did to who you were becoming. And I watched you laugh at me in a ballroom full of your colleagues like it was the funniest thing you'd seen all year." She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat there, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem, staring at the wood grain of the table like it might rearrange itself into an explanation that made this easier to hold. "I didn't mean it the way it looked," she finally said quietly. "It was Damien's idea as a joke, and I laughed because everyone was watching and I panicked and I didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," I said, not unkindly. "You didn't think. Not about how it would feel, not about what it would look like, not about who I actually was to you underneath all of it. Words have a way of showing us exactly what's underneath, Victoria. And what came out that night wasn't a joke. It was contempt. And I think some part of you had been feeling that for a while, long before that card ever got printed." She didn't have an answer for that. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that, the 2 wine glasses sitting mostly untouched between us as the kitchen slowly went dark around us with the last of the November daylight. I won't pretend this story ends with some tidy Hollywood reconciliation, because it doesn't, not fully, not yet. Victoria and I are still working through what comes next, in counseling, slowly, honestly, for the first time in years. She's had to sit with the fact that the man she quietly mocked as boring and forgettable was the same man who'd been protecting her independence the entire time, at real personal cost to himself. I've had to sit with the fact that hiding an entire piece of my life from my own wife, even with good intentions, built a wall that made it far too easy for her to forget who I really was. Damien Caldwell, from what I understand, has resurfaced at another agency across town, presumably telling a very different version of this story to anyone who will listen. I have no interest in what he says. His character showed itself clearly enough in one ballroom on one November evening, and that was all I ever needed to see. I don't share this story because I think humiliating someone in a place card, real or otherwise, is ever the right way to handle conflict, quite the opposite. I share it because I think a lot of us, especially the quiet ones, the ones who don't announce our worth loudly in every room we walk into, get underestimated in ways that eventually catch up with the people doing the underestimating. Words have power. Disrespect has consequences, even when it's dressed up as a joke between people who think no one else is paying attention. And sometimes, the quietest person at the table is the one you should never, ever underestimate. Respect is never optional, and neither is knowing your own worth. If this story hit home, smash that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me below what you think Victoria should have done the moment she saw that place card.